here we go. And now I'll formally welcome Bill Foster. Bill Foster is a professor of management at the Augustana campus, ding ding, Augustana campus of the University of Alberta. His primary research interests include sport fans, rhetorical history, and social memory studies, qualitative research, and business ethics. So he comes with a very different background from what many of us have, and I'm very excited about that. He's been published in journals such as, well, I won't read that list, but there are a list of journals in his areas. He's a former editor-in-chief of Academy of Academy, wow, of Management, Learning, and Education, and serves in the editorial review boards of Organization Studies, Academy of Management Review, Journal of Management Studies, and Human Relations and Business History. And the talk today is qualitative data and its usefulness in sport analytics. And I wouldn't read this out to people, but when I read this, it just made me all that much more excited and interested in the talk. So I'm going to quickly go through this. In the last 30 years, sport analytics have become ever more accepted by teams, players, and fans. Yet there are still debates as to the value that numerical analysis bring to the sport. Some teams have been slow to adopt statistical analysis techniques in their coaching, scouting, and drafting. Also, fans, frustrated by increasingly esoteric discussions of numbers, have been heard deriding the analytics nerds, and it's the same thing with experts everywhere. Experts just get derided in the public, suggesting that they watch the game. The challenge, it seems, is that there's a divide between the different tools that are applied to evaluate the game and what they can tell us about the performance and actions of teams, players, and fans. In this presentation, Bill will explore some of the ways that qualitative data can be used to approach the evaluation and assessment of sport organizations. The goal is to explore and discuss the potential for different uses of qualitative data techniques as a way to enhance the evaluation and measurement of franchises, teams, coaches, players, and fans. And with that, I will stop my share. And do you have access to share?
I will see if I can share my screen with you right now. And I'm starting to share right now. And there we go. And all right. So can everybody see everything that's going on? Are we all good, Tom?
Yes, I can see what you've got there. I don't see it spread out in presenter form, but I do see the PowerPoint.
Oh, you don't see it spread out in okay, just let me make sure.
Yeah, I had to monkey with that too because
yeah, I know what I have.
I
know what I have to do. So I have to go back to new share, and then I have to go to this. How's that?
That's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, Tom, for the warm welcome and the invitation to join everybody at the Sport Analytics Group seminar. I mean, I was very, very excited when Dave reached out to me to ask me to present. And so I'm very, very excited to be here. It's quite interesting that you guys reached out. I haven't really been as focused on sports and sport research over the last number of years, but it is still something that's near and dear to my heart and that I truly do love. So I cut my teeth in with my dissertation. I looked at 11 years of data from baseball and 10 years of data from hockey, and I tried to figure out why sport teams win, in fact, between hockey and baseball. And so that was where I really started with doing a great deal of this work. And I also do research on sports fans. So I'm going to reference a little bit of that. In fact, I have a current project that I'm still working on around the trade of Chris Pronger from the Oilers. So I'm going to talk just briefly about that when I get into some of the empirical examples that I'm going to bring to the discussion of today. But before I get going, I'm going to just open up with the agenda for today. So today I'd like to talk to you about what I'm calling old school versus new school. Old school I'm going to call as the scouts, the eye test, the those of you who have read Moneyball, looks good in jeans type of approach to sport and sport analytics, versus the new school, which typically would be you guys, the Billy Bean Moneyball, some of the new school type of people who are now working in sport leagues, the NBA. So NHL, you've got the Gabe Desjardins, you've got some of the other people, the Eric Tulskis for Carolina. So these are the people who, there's a debate now between these old school and new school. And what I've found through my readings and look at this is that there are two schools of thought that are butting heads. There tends not to be any sort of melding of the two approaches. And I think what I'm going to try and do is try to reconcile this divide, or at least present some opportunities for the reconciliation of these two approaches. So the approach I'm going to take is what many of you might not be familiar with, but I'm hoping some of you are familiar. I'm going to talk about qualitative research and qualitative research methods. I'm going to give you some approaches. I'm going to talk about what they are, how they could be used, and then I'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the empirical applications and examples of this. And then as we've got set up for the seminar, I'll be open to all your questions and comments about what's going on. So before I begin, I'm not sure if all of you are hockey fans. As you can tell, I am. I mean, it's hard not to be a hockey fan growing up in Edmonton pretty much all my life. Just recently, the Oilers have replaced their head coach. So it was formerly Dave Tippett, who I would put in the old school type of category. And they've replaced him with somebody who I might call new school. And this is a new, younger coach. His name is Jay Woodcroft. And just recently, Woodcroft was asked a question about analytics. And so this was his response. And I think that this is a good way for us to sort of frame the conversation as we go forward. So I'm just going to play this. It's about 2 minutes, and I'll let you guys just hear what Woodcroft has to say.
Jay, I just wanted to ask about your use of analytics as a head coach. How would you characterize the role that it plays in your decision-making day to day?
Well, I think it's information, and I believe in collecting as much information as you can in order to make the most informed decisions possible. So I believe in collecting that information. I think there's also the human element of information too, and just talking to people and having a pulse for things. I believe for me that analytics are important, and it's a wave of the future in the game of hockey, but I don't think it's just the only way. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the entire puzzle. I think you have to account for a lot of the things that make up good teams and make up good players as well. So do we use them? Yes, we do use them. For me, like I said, try and gather as much information as can and make the most educated decisions based off that.
I know you have internal analytics as a team, but are there mainstream analytics that are available out there that you would find value in? And I don't know if you would share what you feel is a relevant number at any given point that's available out there.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think there's lots of really good public domain hockey analytics sources. And there's also, most organizations have a department that's geared towards analytics. So for me, I think we're not going to go into trade secrets here or what our staff does, but certainly that's an area that we do put import in. And as I said, I believe in trying to make the most informed decisions possible. And that's part of the equation.
Jay, I just wanted to ask.
So I'm not sure I could have actually asked for anything better to help set up this presentation than hearing what Woodcroft had to say. I don't need to reiterate what he said, but I think what's really interesting is he highlights some of the things that I think we've been, or that have come to be important in the debate around the old school versus new school. And this is the idea of information and what information can tell you. Moreover, I think it's quite interesting that he was very quick to point out that not only do they use analytics, and not only are there public domain analytics, which I think is how many of us got started, but that these are not the end all be all, but that there is still, as he called, the human and the talking to elements. And I think that this is where I'd like to try and propose a melding of the two ideas, is between this information, how do you gather information, and how do you do it with numbers, and how do you do it with the talking to, so that you can bring together a strong and more comprehensive analytic approach to sport teams. And really the question that we have to ask is, what are we talking about here, and why are we doing this? And again, I don't think I have to reiterate this to anybody, but for me, when I'm talking about analytics, it's about measuring performance. So when we're looking at teams, it's wins and losses, coaches, it's their decision making, which I also think is an approach that we need to look at. It's the decision making that lead to win and losses. It's for players, it's how they're on ice or on the field actions lead to wins or losses. And for the franchise, which I make a distinction between the team as the sport side of actions and the franchise, which is the business side of actions, is how the franchise, how their decisions address those who are impacted by wins and losses. So this would be players and fans and communities. So where I'd like to go is just to take a look at this dichotomy that has grown around sport analytics. And the one thing that I will say is that, in my opinion, the big debate comes around four areas. There's transparency, there's repeatability, there's validity, and reliability. And this is the question. These are the four areas that I think are particularly questioned in and around the sport, the old school question statistical analysis in this way. Now we're seeing that the statistics are being accepted more and more and more rapidly, depending on the sport that you're in. So Major League Baseball, as we all know, Bill James and sabermetrics have been around for, geez, it's almost 50 years now, I think, when he first started writing his baseball almanacs. And these numbers and the community that has developed new measures has been around for a significant period of time. You're also seeing this in Premier League. I don't have the NBA up here, but I mean, the NBA is also incorporating their statistics more and more readily. And now the NHL, which is really where my focus is, but the NHL is now starting to use statistics more and more. And you're seeing this as some of those who started to pioneer some of these measures have moved into front office jobs in Carolina, Los Angeles, places like that. And what you're seeing is that the old school is still kind of suspect, because they aren't sure about where some of these numbers come from. And the increase in the use of these statistics is often driven by technology. I mean, the EPL has been collecting data of player tracking for quite some time. Part of my dissertation was around how sports are organized and whether statistics can be used. So baseball, it's not a surprise that it's been quite heavily used or it has used sports quite heavily, because there is a very individual element to the sport versus something like hockey, where one of the critiques that the old school always applies to statistics is that you can't isolate or evaluate individuals on their own, because it's a team sport and it's reciprocally interdependent. And lastly, even though Woodcroft mentioned that the public domain statistics are quite good, one of the questions from the old school is around the reliability of the data. So in hockey in particular, there have been critiques aimed at measures such as Corsi and Fenwick, which are shot metrics. And the issue has come down to, you don't win by having more shots, you win by scoring goals. And so what's the matter? Why are you measuring shots as opposed to measuring goals? On the other hand, you have the new school, which I think many of us would subscribe to, seeing as though this is a sport analytics seminar. But the reason why we believe that the new school in statistical analysis is far more appropriate, and why we critique the old school, is because there's a feeling that the eye, that the scouting, that the look good in jeans crowd miss the fact that there are underlying factors, that there are things that lead to wins that aren't necessarily captured, that you can't see all the time. And this is where you start seeing the question around some of the myths, I'll call them, that appear in particular in hockey, again, because that's where I'm most familiar. But the question that the playoffs are a different game. So you have this notion that, well, you can play one way in the regular season, but then we have to go out and trade for Ben Chariot because he's one of those tough guys that always is gritty in the corners and can scare people so they don't come in and get the puck. I mean, many of us who are subscribed to analytics would question some of those assessments and question some of those arguments, because we see that as being these intangibles that are always being talked about that you can't necessarily measure and put into any sort of analytic framework. So once again, you have this numbers test between the eye test. So the question then becomes, is how do we reconcile this gap between the eye test crowd, which I call the more bigger crowd, versus the analytics nerds? So how do we bring these two crowds together so that we can have a cogent discussion about performance in sport organizations? Before I get further into that, I'm just going to go through how I see analytics, because I expected a statistics crowd, to be honest. And so I thought I would give my approach to how I look at analytics to sort of justify my position in terms of how I'm looking at sport. But as we all know, we have data, which are the raw facts. So shots, goals, assists, these types of things. These are easily collectible and identifiable aspects of the game within different aspects of the game. Then there's information, which is data arranged into a meaningful fashion. So this would be time on ice during a game. This would be things like PDO. So the addition of shooting percentage and save percentage, and normalized to 100%. So these are information that you can give some sense as to what's going on. So you can try to infer or describe what's happening beyond just the raw facts. And so then there are analytics. And I like some of these definitions because they aren't limited to just numerical analysis. So a scientific process of transforming data into insights for the purposes of making better decisions, or the science of analyzing raw data to make conclusions, or the method of logical analysis, which I went and looked up analysis, which is a detailed examination of anything complex in order to study its nature or to determine its essential features, a thorough study. So I think that if we approach analytics as being able to incorporate both a statistical side or a numerical side and a qualitative or non-numeric side, then we have to ask as to how we're going to approach this. And part of the reason why I think we need to do this is if we look at the different types of analytics that we have. In business, we talk a little bit about business analytics in terms of 4 types. This is just one heuristic to understand analytics. It isn't the end all and be all, but I thought it was appropriate for what we're doing today. So you have the descriptive, which explains what happens, the diagnostic, which explains why it happened, the predictive, which forecasts what might happen, and then the prescriptive that recommends an action based on the forecast. So if we keep these in mind, I think I'm going to come back to this a little bit later. But the idea that I have is, how can we fit what we're doing now, and then how can we fit a joining of both a qualitative and a quantitative approach into these different types of business analytic frameworks. So before I get going, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about qualitative research, because I'm not sure that everybody understands what I mean and what it is. And typically, it's interesting when I teach a qualitative research class for the DBA program at Athabasca University in their business school. And one of the things that happens when I start with the qualitative research classes is you get one or two students who are quite skeptical of qualitative research. And this is typically because they come from a quantitative background. They're very comfortable with numbers, and they suspect that qualitative research, because it involves an element of interpretation, and a significant element of interpretation that they feel, that it is biased and non-generalizable, and it's all feeling. And so what I think I have to be able to do is to justify and to support my my argument here today is to sort of disabuse this idea that qualitative research is just sort of reading things and coming up with an interpretation. I mean, there's an element of that as well. But one of the things that I think is so powerful about qualitative research is that it's a way of approaching the natural world, and that it is about analyzing what happens around us, as opposed to collecting other data. I mean, numeric data is arguably, unless you're doing counting, it can be proxies for a lot of the things that are being said. Qualitative research is looking at the natural world, whether it be what's been written down, what you've observed, how you've collected this information from people that you've talked to. And what makes it particularly useful is that you use multiple methods, that it's not just one method. So much like how you would use a different statistical formula, there are different methods that can be used in qualitative research to try and get at, to answer a particular question. It focuses on context. What it's curious about are particularly emergent answers as opposed to specified answers. So oftentimes you'll go into asking questions as to why something's happened or how something's happened, as opposed to having a specific question to answer. And it is fundamentally interpretive, which means that there is an element of reading and understanding, which depends on your where you come at things and how you approach the information. But I will just say that just because it's interpretive does not mean that it's not rigorous. Because the particular factor about qualitative research that makes it interesting is that, and makes it different from the eye test, is that it's concerned with issues of transparency, repeatability, reliability, and validity. So this means that it's not just a scout going and seeing a player and saying, hey, he's really good because he's a 5-tool guy. With qualitative research, the idea is to demonstrate how you arrived at your results, to ensure that your results can be repeated, to ensure that your results are reliable, that you're actually getting what you're trying to address, or you're getting the measures that you're trying to create, and that you're addressing the questions that you're trying to address, and that they're valid so that they make sense in terms of what you're saying. So I think this is where we have the significant disconnect between the old school and the new school, and why there's distrust and disagreement is because there isn't a shared understanding about transparency, repeatability, reliability, and validity. And what I'm going to propose with a further discussion of different types of methods is ways that you can approach transparency, repeatability, reliability, and validity such that you can assuage some of these disagreements and some of these some of the reasons for distrust amongst the two schools. So there are a number of different methods. And one of the things that often isn't known is that qualitative methods can take many different forms. Many people think that it's just interviews, right? You interview somebody, but there are case studies, there's textual analysis, action research, hermeneutics, phenomenology. They're all methods that are used to address different types of questions and different types of understandings that you might want to uncover when you're looking at your data. So for example, I'm going to talk a little bit about case studies, but just before we get into an empirical example, case studies are not just the use of interviews or observational data or archival research. You can also throw in statistics. You can also typically descriptive statistics, surveys, these types of things. So it brings together a significant number of different approaches so that you can understand what's going on. The key thing to remember when employing these types of qualitative research methods is that each method has a particular relevance for the questions that are being asked. So I always tell my students when I'm talking to them in the qualitative research class that when you learn these things, you think that it's a hammer and that everything becomes a nail. Well, that's not always the case. Not every method is particularly useful for every question that you have to ask. And this is where I think that, again, bringing these two approaches together, the old school and the new school together, one of the things that can be particularly useful is understanding which type of qualitative method can be matched with a particular statistical method to try and give you a more comprehensive answer about performance. So what? So why does this really matter? Well, if we think that we go back to the idea of the 4 types of analytics, I would make the argument that there are the current statistical analytics are focused, particularly the public domain statistics, are focused on descriptive and some diagnostic and maybe a little bit of predictive. I think that there's a greater place for more discussion of diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, and this can help bridge the old school and the new school. So if we look at it here, I think that this is where we typically are with a little bit of descriptive and diagnostic with our discussions using statistical analysis and statistical analytics in sport right now, and a little bit of predictive. So we can sort of see where it's at. Where I'd like us to go, and where I think we can have a little bit more impact, is in our discussions about why things have happened, what might happen, and in particular, I think you can recommend courses of action based on some of the analysis. Now, I know some of you guys are sitting there like just grinding your teeth going, well, what about algorithms and these types of things? They're prescriptive, they can help us understand. And yes, I do understand that. And I think that that's where we can bring these also, and we can meld them together to understand what we can do and some of the recommendations that we can bring together. So I'm going to conclude a little bit here by giving you guys some examples of what I'm talking about, because I know that I've got basically about like 10, 15 minutes left. I'm going to talk about 3 specific examples that I think that we can, where we can see these types of melding being used over the next coming years so that we can bring together this old school and new school. I'm going to start with case studies. Now, one of the things that happens in business quite a lot is that there's business cases are used in terms of decision making. I know many consultants who, when they're trying to get people to make decisions, particular in the clients that have been hired by them, they write a business case. And this business case is a way of making decisions. So what you do is you outline, you collect the data, you collect qualitative data. This is through interviews, this is through archival research, through different types of observations. Also does include some surveys, so you can augment that with statistical information. But you bring these things together and you set up the best case scenario or the worst case scenario for decision making. One of the things that we could see is in sport organizations, you could do this. I mean, again, I'll go back to the Oilers, and Ken Holland, who's the general manager of the Oilers, said that he fired the coach, Dave Tippett, and hired the guy that whose video I just showed you, Jay Woodcroft, based on a gut feeling. Now, in the recent Forbes ranking of franchise valuations for the NHL, the Edmonton Oilers were valued at $1.1 billion US. I hate to say it, but when you're making a decision as significant as a personnel change for your team, doing this based on a gut feel isn't necessarily how an organization of this stature and this value should be making decisions. And I don't think that this is limited to just the Oilers when it comes to decision making. So my argument being is that when you're making personnel decisions, when you're making long-term investments regarding facilities, when it comes to how you're playing the game, these types of issues could be best dealt with through a business case and debating business cases. Similarly, you can write case studies around team performance. I think that some of the things that I'm talking about could be applied to the betting market as well as the just internal team markets, where what you can look at is why some teams have historically overperformed or underperformed at particular venues. So why is it that, well, for years, the Edmonton Oilers couldn't win in the Boston Gardens? So people would say, well, it's because the Boston Gardens, when it was built, it was a 200 by 75 foot arena. The same with the Buffalo Auditorium. These historically smaller arenas caused problems. Well, again, that's anecdotal data that we can't necessarily quantify or understand whether that's actually the case. Writing a business case around performance, underperformance, and overperformance with qualitative data that is augmented with statistical data could help both those in the betting crowd, so those who are gambling on sports, or even teams understand what it is that leads to historical underperformance or overperformance within a particular venue. And this could lead to significant increases or decreases in team performance if you find that there's a particular variable that is causing the team to underperform or overperform. And if we think about how important it is to do things like make the playoffs in North American professional team sport, the difference in 2-3 wins a season could be a significant boost in not just reputation and in terms of winning, but also in terms of revenue for teams. So I think that that's one area where case studies could be particularly useful. An area that I'm particularly interested in and that I use regularly is one called textual analysis. Some of you might have also heard it called rhetorical analysis or discourse analysis. I've been a big believer that this is one of the places that sports teams have been quite deficient in terms of understanding and of using when trying to understand both their players and their fans. The examples that I've got here, I'm calling are scouting and drafting. Conversation analysis and interview analysis are significant factors that could be used to understand different types of players and why they perform better than others. There is now, some people might see this as psychology, and yes, there is an approach called discursive psychology, but I'm advocating for it from a more rhetorical, textual approach, where what you do is you look for themes in players' conversations, and you do this over a long-term period using historical data, written historical data. So you can talk to these kids as they're coming up. You can have conversations with people while they are free agents. You can look back at their interviews and you can analyze them to see if there's certain themes. Also, you can go back and you can look at the themes that have emerged in the conversations of previous superstars or previous players that have underperformed. Drawing these connections and these themes, again, augmented with a statistical analysis, I think provides greater insight into how players could perform. And it could also help you at the drafting table. So you can sit down and say, I've got 2 kids to pick, and who am I going to choose? This goes back to, again, the Oilers. whether you choose Steve Kelly or you choose Shane Doan. I'm not sure that a conversation analysis would have helped push them in one way or the other, but I'm taking a guess that it would be a significant point of data that you could use in terms of your analysis. Another place for textual analysis is in terms of fan behavior. This is where I do a significant amount of research. What my colleagues and I have done is that we've collected data from web boards, in particular the Oilers web boards, and we've analyzed how fans talked about, in this particular case, the trade of Chris Pronger. And one of the things that's quite interesting that we've found is that there's a significant amount of what we've called trauma involved with the trading of Pronger. So for context, the Oilers made it to the finals of the Stanley Cup. They lost in the 7th game, and then the following summer they traded Chris Pronger, their best player, for 5 players and draft picks. And the Oilers have underperformed as a team ever since. This trade is a particular point in the history of the franchise that people still go back to. And the understanding the trauma that this caused could help teams understand how best to deal with their fans. The Oilers are notoriously bad for dealing with their fans, and they're dealing with fans and addressing their needs. Having more insight into how they talk about things could help organizations in general when trying to reach out and create new relationships with fans. The last thing I'm going to point out, because again, I'm running out of time, is action research. So action research is basically where an organization takes an active role in trying to create a change. Or I'm going to flip it on its head. This is when other organizations outside of sports teams take an active role to disrupt or change what's happening with regards to the team. So I've got listed here stadium debates, public funding, team relocation. If you take approaches to social and collective movements, this type of action research could be one way to steamroll and to push forward decisions or to prevent decisions that aren't necessarily optimum for communities or other organizations. Some of you might know Thin Ice. It was a book written years ago about the Winnipeg Jets and their relocation to Atlanta. The Thin Ice was a group that basically engaged in action research. Although unsuccessful, they laid a template for how not just qualitative data, but also economic impact assessments and statistical data can be used to try and force or to make sport organizations change their decisions about their actions. So those are 3 types of examples that I think work very, very well when discussing bringing together of both these statistical old school and the statistical new school and the eye test old school. So to recap, I still think that there's a continued debate between the 2 camps regarding performance, around transparency. These debates are focused around transparency, repeatability, reliability, and validity. I see that the introduction of qualitative methods to augment statistical analysis to address diagnostic, predictive, and prescriptive analytics is really one of the ways that we can start to bridge this gap between the old school and the new school. And I think there are a number of implications that can be brought to bear on this. You can look at things like decision-making. One thing I didn't mention, but there is a significant push now in organizational research to bring discussions of emotions into decision-making and into understanding employee actions. One of the things that hasn't really been discussed is how does shame, for instance, impact player performance? I'm not sure we can measure shame, but if any of you have seen how players are treated in some markets around leagues, Russell Westbrook is a particular example. He is, I would argue, being continually shamed, yet nobody has questioned how this has affected his performance. So I think that's the type of factor that could be brought more to discussions around performance, especially player performance. Also, I think that there are different viewpoints of performance that could be addressed. So how is it measured? And also whether this comes from both inside and outside the organization. And lastly, I think that one of the things that we can bring to bear on this is that if you bring qualitative research in and to augment statistical research, I think that this can help critique some of the primarily managerialist focus on sport analytics. So how do we make the team better? How do we focus particularly from a managerial standpoint? We can bring it to a more of a player side, more of a fan side, and also this can help democratize different types of approaches to sport analytics. So that's all I have for you guys. Thank you very much for inviting me to share my ideas with you. If you have any questions or comments, I would love to hear them.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Bill. While I wait for others to put a hand up or to jump in later, one of the, you mentioned specifically text analysis.
Yes.
Trying to use information about conversations to do analysis, but I imagine, and this is probably just because of my statistics background, I imagine that it's very difficult to try to infer good meaning from text analysis, because the methods of gathering text, conversation, and so forth are rather ad hoc. So are going to be, from a statistical perspective, fraught with collection bias, say sampling bias. You talk to the players a lot who are considered very highly. You don't talk to the players very much who aren't considered as much, but who might be the hidden gems. I wonder what, is this an issue? Is this a concern about the source of the data when one tries to use text analysis in a qualitative manner?
So that's a really good question. So I guess the best way to approach this would be to suggest, what is the question you want to answer? So if you're looking at trying to address how players deal with pressure, then I would argue that you could go and you could get interviews with players around how they talk about dealing with pressure. Now, this doesn't mean that you're getting what would be honest, right? I mean, one of the questions around qualitative data is, are people telling you the truth, especially interview data? Well, what's interesting as a qualitative researcher is that it doesn't really matter if they're telling the truth, because what you're getting at is what they're willing to share with you. And that in analysis can tell you as much, if not even more, about what's being said. Mm-hmm. So if somebody decides to tell you that they're great under pressure, but they end up being terrible in pressure situations, you can sort of reconcile that and say, well, hey, look, this guy isn't really honestly assessing his game, which would be one point of data when you're trying to say, well, is he someone that we want on our team? So I think that the other thing that you can do, the quality of data, I think, is a question, but if you get enough text and you start analyzing it, like there are numerous statistical qualitative data analysis programs where you can take large amounts of data and you can whittle it down and what's called clean it. It's much like cleaning like statistical data. And you can then put it into these programs and run what's called supercodes to find thematic analysis that come throughout. So I'm not sure that the quality of data is particularly relevant as when it comes to analysis that way. And the last thing I'll say about this is that when there's a thing called topic modeling, which is basically big data applied to linguistics. And so if you get a large enough sample of data, whether that be a corpus of like interviews or newspaper articles or whatever it may be, if you get enough of these, you should be able to find consistent themes that emerge throughout the data. So that's the type of thing that qualitative data would be looking at and how you do the analysis of it.
Okay, I'm imagining something like, because I'm a I am a member of what I believe is the longest continuous running fantasy baseball league in the world.
Okay.
We started in the 1970s, and I don't think anybody goes earlier than that. The rotisserie started in 1980s. So every year I'm scouring, because it's a keeper league. I'm scouring the minor leagues, trying to find players who are going to be the next superstars. And I'm imagining a situation where I can look at, a list of the published top 100 with a couple of paragraphs written about each one, pull that down, analyze that text, and get it from several different sources and try to find themes in the players that aren't covered in sort of the numeric ranking and numbers. Is that something that you imagine to be a use for what you're talking about?
That would be one. Absolutely. I think that would be, and in fact, what I would do is I would augment that with player interviews, because now that players are being interviewed over and over and over again, you could then supplement that into your sample. You could then get scouting reports that you could then put into your samples. You could get conversations from GMs about these players. You could get conversations and data from agents about what they say about these guys. All
surely,
that together.
Surely at the top prospect level, all of that stuff exists somewhere. Yeah,
I would think so.
Surely, yeah.
Well, and I also think that you could find some of this with even lower level players. I mean, in larger markets, just because you'll get more from Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl versus Zach Kassian. But you're still in large markets going to get interviews from players like that. You always have the journalists who are trying to do a special interest piece about somebody. You have, going back to junior days, or, I mean, for example, in Kassian's the case, he's had run-ins with the law. These types of things all tend to appear in the public record in textual data that you could then collect, put into analytics, and then be able to rigorously and transparently analyze to try and come up with themes in the data.
Yeah, all of that stuff's got to be around somewhere if you can just imagine it and get to it. Yeah,
and that's the big thing, is it takes an element of creativity, because I mean, when I was doing my dissertation, it was a matter of finding who was collecting the stats and writing them down and putting them into a format that you could easily download and put into, in my case, like an Excel spreadsheet. Now it's a matter of getting creative. And as you pointed out, like, what makes sense in terms of the data that you're collecting? Like, you try and get as much as you can, but then you have to start breaking it down and then adding to it through different ways. So, I mean, one of the other interesting things is that maybe try to find interviews with these people if you can. I mean, granted, it's not cost effective. It takes a lot of work, qualitative analysis. And I think that's also one of the reasons why it hasn't been used more readily. If you look at how scouts and the efforts that they have to put in, they have to travel, they have to write their reports, they then have to log them, then they have to look at them. Qualitative research takes a lot of effort to be able to come up with meaningful results. And I think that that's part of the reason why it's not used more readily.
Yeah. I want to make sure everybody else has an opportunity to ask Bill some questions. So if you have one, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away. And if there aren't others, I'll throw another one out there, because I often think about this when I teach any regression course. And you start with a regression model that has y equals, and then the regression model, and then you throw this plus epsilon on there, and this epsilon is supposed to be the error. But I always try to explain to a class that error isn't necessarily just random noise per se, but it's sort of the accumulated effect of all of the things that you couldn't, decided not to measure, decided not to put into your model at the moment. So I'm sort of imagining that a lot of qualitative research output is trying to attack that epsilon. It's trying to attack that stuff that you don't know exactly what to measure. You don't know how to measure it. That we can only model what we can measure. And there's more to life than what we can measure. And so I'm imagining that putting the actual human eye and the human brain into something and then trying to pluck that information out somehow is part of what the qualitative aspect would be about.
Absolutely. I think you're from a statistical description, you are absolutely correct that this is what we're talking about. There's this notion of, well, I always talk about it as the how or the why. And statistical data is getting better at explaining hows and whys. But I think the qualitative data has particular relevance for trying to explain those types of questions. And the error term is, are all those things that are not all the things in the model, but they're the things in the model that you haven't taken into consideration yet. And I mean, when you get an R squared of like 30%, and you think that that's actually a good element of explaining what's going on, that means that there's a whole lot more that you have to take into consideration to try and say, why are things happening this way? And it's interesting because, I mean, when we're looking at statistics and we're looking at qualitative data, it's always backwards looking, right? We're taking the data and then we're looking at it now and saying, because of what's happened, we're trying to predict future performance and trying to predict what's going to happen. It's hard to do. And so the more data that you have, the more information that you have and that you can bring to your decision making is always better. You're never going to have all the information, but I think, as I've said, the old school versus the new school, basically not talking to each other limits how effective your models are at predictive and prescriptive analytics. So I think that this is why bringing qualitative research to these decision-making models is very, very important and something that we should do more often.
If somebody has a very strong analytics brain and isn't quite sure what all of that really means, I think that's one way to get at them, is to say, well, all that stuff that you haven't measured still might have an effect somehow. How do we get at that? And at the very, very least, it might be a way to identify new things that we can try to start to measure. maybe we need to routinely start measuring, a person's psychological profile or their past history with the law or something like that. Is there predictive information in that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's one of the key things that is often disregarded. I mean, it was funny. I was telling my wife this before we were that I was going to be presenting here. And she says, well, it's interesting that you're bringing this to bear, because players are still treated like cattle, where we can like poke them, prod them, pinch them, measure them, and then say, well, that's what we're going to get out of them, as opposed to bringing other things like emotions, context, like these types of factors and variables that can have an impact on not just their performance, but team and coach performance as well, and how fans see this in addition.
Yeah, I was just recently reading about the I think it was the late 90s NFL draft, where Mike Ditka of the New Orleans Saints traded away his entire draft to buy Ricky Williams, to draft Ricky Williams. Yeah. And Ricky, it turns out, had some issues. He had today we would recognize them perhaps as mental health issues, and he probably needed, probably needed some counseling, probably needed some therapy, and might have been an all-around better asset to a team had he gotten the help he needed. And this was something some GMs apparently noticed this at the time and said, this, I'm not sure about this guy's commitment. This guy's got some, but is that just bias, or is that something real? Well, some people picked up on a vibe, if nothing else, and didn't know what to do with it.
Well, and it's interesting that you use Ricky Williams as an example, because he is a very early case of someone who likely now would be described as having mental health issues. And this wasn't helped by where not only was he self-medicating with marijuana to help mitigate some of those things, which is an issue or was an issue at the time in the NFL, but also, if you recall, Ditka and then Ricky Williams went onto the cover of Sport Illustrated, where they dressed him up into a bride's dress and put him onto the cover.
Yeah.
And to think that, is that necessarily a healthy thing to do for someone with mental health issues?
Yeah.
So also too, would you want Mike Ditka as your coach if you have self-esteem or mental health issues?
Yeah, he wouldn't be the most touchy-feely guy you could imagine.
Yeah.
Tim Swartz has a question. I'll go ahead and let Tim ask one.
Sure.
Hi, Bill. Thanks for speaking to our group today. This isn't really a question, but it's a story that I thought you might find a little bit amusing. It has to do with your characterization of new school versus old school people. So I was at an event a couple of years ago, and the coach of the Vancouver Whitecaps was there. It was Carl Robinson at the time, and he's an old school guy. And I told him that I was interested in sports analytics, and I did research in the area. And I asked him, what, in his opinion, is like a really important topic in sports analytics. What would he like to see some work done? What topic would he like to have work done on? And his answer to me was this. He looked at me and he said, "I see the game with my eyes." So he was definitely an old school character.
Yeah.
I thought you might enjoy that.
Well, and to be honest, Tim, that's exactly the types of that's exactly the divide that I'm trying to bridge here, is because these guys seem to think that there's nothing that the analytics brings. But if the analytics guys are going to talk to the seen 'em good crowd, then we have to find a way to talk to them in their own language so that they can understand what we see and how that can then help them see the game differently. And I mean, some guys, I mean, if you read Kuhn's the science of about scientific revolutions, he talks about paradigm shifts. I think we're in the middle of one right now, but as he points out, the only way that the paradigm shift actually takes hold is if the old guys actually die and the new ideas start taking hold. So, I mean, I'm hoping we don't have to get to that extreme. I'm hoping that we can bring the divide together a little bit quicker, but
maybe retirement would suffice.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm not sure that a lot of these guys, I mean, is there other than academics, maybe, like, is there a place where you see old people holding on longer and longer? And like, I mean, this is where you get like sports. I mean, Ken Holland at the Oilers, he had retired and they brought him out of retirement to run the team. I mean, this is just, it's hard to get rid of these guys, especially when they see the game in a particular way. So I'm hopeful.
Well, does anybody else have any questions that they can ask of Bill? We're basically at the end of our standard time, but we'll be able to take maybe another question or so if there is one. Or comments, I guess, doesn't have to be a question. And if not, then I think we can go ahead and shut this down. I want to take another moment to thank Bill very much for his entertaining and different perspective discussion here for us today. I very much appreciate being able to see I believe that most of the world's problems will be solved with better communication, or at least will not be made worse with better communication. And so by increasing the way we communicate with people who think about these problems differently from the analytics perspective, I think that we're going to make progress. So thanks very much, Bill, for your entertaining and enlightening presentation. And I will now shut down. Let's see if I can find the point. I will now shut down the recording.